All right, well, it's 11 o'clock, so I think we can go ahead and get started here. Firstly, I wanted to say hello and welcome everyone to this webinar. Today, we're going to be learning about Washington aquatic plant technical assistance and invasive aquatic plants to look out for. But before we begin, I wanted to briefly go over a couple housekeeping details here. Firstly, we are recording the webinars, and the recordings are going to be posted on our website. Now, if you have questions for the speakers as the presentations move along, please put them in the Q&A box in Zoom. You should see it on your Zoom toolbar. And please only use the chat for technical difficulties. So don't put any questions into the chat, only the Q&A. We are going to have a poll during the webinar, so we want to make sure you stay engaged and pay attention. So please listen carefully to the speaker so that you are able to answer the polling question. And this is important, especially if you are seeking pesticide recertification credit. And finally, if you lose connection to the webinar, it's just going to be the same link to rejoin. And there's also a phone number on the email you received. If you're unable to sign in on your computer, you can definitely call in and still at least hear the audio. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Justin Bush for the introduction.
All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining today. This is a very special week. Governor Jay Inslee proclaimed February 20th to the 26th as Invasive Species Awareness Week in Washington. This is in solidarity with the national event that's happening with events all around the United States during the same time period. Invasive species pose a significant threat to our economy as well as our resources. Putting some numbers to the problem, invasive species has cost the nation over $1.2 trillion over the past 50 years. This is in management costs and also in damage to our agriculture, to our recreation, to jobs. And really the takeaway is that we can solve this problem by working together across jurisdictions, whether we're talking about aquatic or terrestrial plants, animals, or diseases. There's simple actions we can all take in our everyday lives to be part of the solution. And the number one thing is reporting. And the second thing is if you see something, say something. So knowing where to report it so that it can inform management or research. So really wish you all a happy Invasive Species Awareness Week, and visit our website to learn about other great events that we have today. And with that, I thank you and turn it back to Maria.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Justin. All right. With that, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker today, Ann Schuster. And Ann's going to provide an overview of the noxious weeds list and law.
Yes. Hello. So I am the education specialist for the Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board, and my PowerPoint is just a little bit slow when I first start presenting, but it'll work eventually. There we are. So first I'm going to go through basic weed law, how you all can get involved, and also the classification of weeds in Washington. So the weed law as we currently have it was created in 1975 to stop economic loss as well as environmental harm, to kind of at least limit it from weeds in Washington. But it originally goes back even further than that. I believe the first noxious weed law in Washington was from 1905, and that was just for trying to stop Canada thistle, which is everywhere. So clearly it didn't work that well. But now things are a lot more smooth than they used to be. There's also, in addition to the noxious weed list, there's also the prohibited plants list, which is administered by the WSDA. So between these two laws, it pretty much covers all invasive plant laws in Washington. Anybody can get involved in the listing process for the noxious weed list. This time of year, from January 1st to April 30th, is when anybody in the state can submit proposals for a non-native plant to be considered for listing. It can be a really simple proposal, such as the name of the plant and why you think it should be listed. Just an email or snail mail, both good. starting in May and going until September. The Noxious Weed Committee then researches all the proposals and makes recommendations to the board for a final public hearing and before a final vote for what ends up actually getting put into the final law, which gets updated in January. So any of you watching, anybody that you know can get involved in this process by just going to our website and letting us know. After the state weed list gets updated, all the counties then update their weed lists. They have about 90 days to do so. They have to take any Class A's that were listed. They also have to take any Class B's that were listed in their area, and then they can select any other Class B's and any Class C's and not listed plants at all to put on their own lists. Lots of times they will use those additional species for things that are priorities or that they just want to do education for. So now I'm going to go through the classification of weeds. So Class A weeds are the highest priority species to control in Washington state. And these are ones where eradication is actually required, not just control. So eradication means every part of the plant has to be disposed of or destroyed properly. No matter where they are in the state, they have to be completely removed. So this means that these plants are usually rarer in the state. Either there's a lot of action going towards monitoring for them and actively controlling for them, or sometimes they're plants that aren't even present in the state yet, and we've seen them starting to become a problem in like Idaho or Oregon, and we just want to stop it before it really gets out of hand here. All of these plants are automatically added to the prohibited plants list. Class B is the next classification down. These are weeds that are very widespread in some parts of the state, but not in others, or problems in certain parts of the state, but not in others. So Scotch broom is an example of a Class B weed in Washington state, where it is so widespread in Western Washington, it's not economically feasible to control it in Western Washington anymore, but Eastern Washington still has a chance. And so it is required for control in most of Eastern Washington, but not required for control in just about anywhere in Western Washington. So Class B weeds, rather than eradication being the goal, it's control being the goal, which means any part of the plant that can reproduce needs to be removed and disposed of. So for Scotch broom, it would just have to be its flowers and seeds. For something like butterfly bush, it would have to be any plant part because it can reproduce by root fragment or stem fragment. So that can be a little bit difficult or different. So like Scotch broom, mowing counts as control. Class C weeds are weeds that are everywhere for the most part. Canada thistle is an example of this, where it's very widespread in pretty much the entire state, and probably very few places require them for control. They might just have them on their local county lists to educate people, or because it's a priority in certain parts of the county. The prohibited plants list, also known as the quarantine list, this is the one that's administered by the Washington State Department of Agriculture. These are plants that are not allowed to be sold in Washington or sold from Washington. Any sale or owning of these plants is illegal. Everything on the Class A automatically gets added to this list. Quite a few of our Class B's and C's are also on this list, but definitely not all of them. And so, for example, you're still allowed to buy English ivy in Washington state because it's not on the prohibited plants list, even though it is a Class C noxious weed. So there are also plants on this list that aren't on our noxious weed list, and most of those are aquatic plants. They are usually plants that are in aquariums or in ponds, that sort of thing. And I'm not sure exactly the reasoning why they haven't been added to the noxious weed list. It could be that they just haven't been considered yet. And then the final list that we have is the monitor list. And this is not a legal list at all. These are just plants that we want to get more information about. So an example of this would be stinking iris. Another example of this would be fuki or Japanese coltsfoot. These are plants that they could be on the noxious weed list. We just don't know enough about their spread and invasiveness in Washington yet. And so these are ones where we really rely on reports from the public about them. And every one of these plants on any of these lists are on our website. And for the monitor list, there's also a contact for the person gathering information about them. And every few years, we'll ask that person for all the reports they've gotten, any information they've gathered about this plant, and then the board will consider adding it to the noxious weed list or maybe removing it from the monitor list because it turns out it's not actually probably going to be a problem in the near future. That's pretty much the simple rundown of the noxious weed law in Washington.
Great. Thank you, Anne. All right. Our next speaker is Lisbeth Seebecker with the Department of Ecology, and she's going to talk about Aquatic Invasive Plant Program.
Great. Let me share my screen here. Very good. Can everybody hear me? And does it look okay? Okay, very good. Yeah, Elizabeth Seebecker. I'm with the Department of Ecology, and I'm going to speak to you today about Ecology's Aquatic Invasive Plant Program. It is not moving. Oh, there we go. In 1991, the Washington State Legislature established the Freshwater Aquatic Invasive Plant Program. RCW 650 set up the account, and RCW 660 directs the spending. The formal description is the Aquatic Weeds Management Fund, which provides financial and technical assistance to local and state governments, tribes, and special purpose districts to reduce the propagation of freshwater aquatic invasive plants and to manage the problems these invasive plants provide or the cause. This account provides funds for the aquatic plant specialist, or Wes, who you're going to hear from next, and a portion of myself, I'm the project manager, the technical advisor, and the fund coordinator for all the projects funded by this program, as well as part of our NPDES permit person, Sean Oltkin. The program is funded by an annual license fee assessed to the owners of boat trailers, and it has a 2/3 pass-through requirement that funds grants for invasive plant control and abatement. Now, this program provides funds for the following: activities intended to prevent, reduce, or manage excessive growth of freshwater aquatic invasive plants, emphasis on invasive. Removal or control of native species cannot be funded by this program. It can fund development of public education programs relating to the management of aquatic invasive plants, as well as applied research projects. Now, there are 3 types of grant projects or opportunities that we fund through this program. The Integrated Aquatic Vegetation Management Plan, or IAVMP. The water body must have a recent IAVMP in order to qualify for control project funds. So an IAVMP is the first step. And there is a template for that on the DOE website. We fund aquatic invasive plant control projects, of course, which is primarily what we fund each year, which is work on the ground or in the water in this case, in the form of control and or some cases eradication. This program can fund early infestation projects, which are defined as a situation in which an invasive, non-native aquatic plant is discovered in its pioneer stages in any particular water body. The early infestation opportunity allows local municipalities and ecology to respond to early infestations when immediate corrective action is likely to achieve eradication or containment. And because it's essential to begin work quickly as possible, applications for early infestation grants can be submitted at any time throughout the year. All require a 25% match, except early infestation and research projects only require a 12.5% match. And that's at this time. There's talk about that maybe going away. So the goal is not to end up with a water body that has little to no aquatic or emergent vegetation. The objective is to restore a diverse native plant community. Aquatic macrophytes play a significant role in maintaining water quality and ecosystem health. A healthy native plant population supports a wide diversity of aquatic organisms by providing spawning habitat, nursery, refuge, forage grounds for many species. Aquatic and emergent plants can stabilize sediment, generate organic material needed by small invertebrates, and can add oxygen to the surrounding water column. Some species, such as bulrushes, can absorb and break down contaminants. Additionally, nutrients used by aquatic plants for growth are not available to algae or cyanobacteria, thereby reducing cyanobacteria abundance, further improving water clarity and water quality. Also, something to keep in mind, emergent species can assist with wave attenuation and therefore help prevent shoreline erosion. So a healthy aquatic macrophyte community consists of a high diversity of native taxa, and that's what we want. On the other hand, the impacts of aquatic invasive plants, researchers have found that native aquatic plants, or that invasive aquatic plants can have significant effects on littoral food webs. Some species have such high levels of biomass, Brazilian Eladia, for example, that when the plants die back in the fall, dissolved oxygen in the water column can be greatly reduced due to decomposition. And these levels of biomass can also slow water movement and increase water temperature. Previous research shows that invasive plants can alter ecosystem processes such as nutrient dynamics. And past studies have demonstrated that fish can hang out in invasive plant populations, but their foraging is typically greatly reduced in these habitats. Another recent study on the impacts of Brazilian Eladia on juvenile coho in Alaska found that Eladia stands resulted in reduced growth and a lower trophic position for juvenile coho. Now, coho salmon specifically are already greatly impacted by the newly discovered contaminant in stormwater, 6-ppd quinone, which can cause very high mortality rates. So adding on another impact on growth to juvenile coho can be even more detrimental to their population numbers. And one, last but not least, a paper by a researcher at the UW found that milfoil, our most common aquatic invasive plant, had a significant negative impact on property values, with a 19% decline in property values on lakes with Eurasian water milfoil infestations. While at the UW as a research scientist, Lauren Keene, who you will hear from soon, looked at the impacts of a particularly nasty invasive plant, parrot feather. She found that the abundance of parrot feather has consequences for slow-flowing riverine habitats, and these pictures are in the Chehalis River, in ways that are distinctive from effects of native plants. She found dramatic reductions in dissolved oxygen when parrot feather is dominant, approaching hypoxic conditions. She also found that parrot feather disrupts typical patterns of habitat complexity through the addition of this dense biomass. And during this research project, she observed that the numbers of Olympic mud minnow, which is typically tolerant of low dissolved oxygen levels, declined when thin, dense populations of parrot feather. And of note is that the Olympic mud minnow is Washington's only endemic freshwater fish. She also found that other invasive populations, such as bullfrog, increased within parrot feather infestations. Researchers have found quite a few examples of invasive plant species that harbor invasive animal species. So what can you do? Clean, drain, and dry your boat and boat trailer. These photos give you an idea of how easily plants can get moved from lake to lake on boats and boat trailers, as well as other equipment. Never release pets or dump aquariums. We have determined that quite a few invasive plant introductions were due to aquarium dumps. Never move organisms from one lake to another. And learn more about invasive plants and what to look out for. Lauren will be speaking soon on the Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council, or IPSC, and their Early Detection Rapid Response Program and trainings that IPSC provides. She'll also go over how to report invasive species via EDMAPs. And last but not least, try to only plant native species in your yard, or at least make sure that you're not spreading invasive plants when planting ornamental species. It's relatively easy to find invasive plants and trees for sale at nurseries. And this photo is a perfect example of an ornamental that has become a significant problematic invasive plant in Washington state. This is flowering rush. It was planted as an ornamental in Washington, and you can see why. The flowers are quite lovely. But it is now spreading throughout many water bodies in our state and has detrimental impacts on our native ecosystems. And that's all I have for you today. I'll be available for any questions at the end of the session after all the speakers, and I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. All right. Next up, we have Wes Gleason from the Department of Ecology, and he's going to talk about a few target species to be on the lookout for.
All right, make sure I'm all set there. Everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
All right, excellent. Thanks so much, Maria. So thank you to you and Justin for and the Invasive Species Council for having me talk here today. I'm excited to talk about this topic. And make sure, give me 1 second here. Everyone can hear me okay, right? Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And I also want to thank Elizabeth for that, bringing up our program and talking about the aquatic plant management program from the Department of Ecology. So as Maria said, my talk really has 2 components. The first is going to be talking about the aquatic plant technical assistance that our program provides, and then also a handful of invasive aquatic plants to look out for in the state. So the overall goal of the Aquatic Invasive Plant Program with Ecology is pretty simple: reduce aquatic invasive plants in Washington. As many folks know, though, it's really not quite that simple. So there's many ways that I can help. And I want to highlight 3 ways that our program helps provide technical assistance. So how is this accomplished? How do we help? The first is species identification. Next is knowledge of native and invasive aquatic plant distribution, so where those plants occur throughout the state. And third is knowledge of best management practices. How do we manage these aquatic invasive plants? And I'm going to go through each one of these in detail in the next couple slides. So who do we help? Really everyone in the state. Groups of folks that we've helped in the past include local governments, citizen groups, state agencies, tribes, county weed boards, you name it. In regards to where do we help, our focus is statewide, primarily, as Elizabeth mentioned, on publicly accessible water bodies, so those with a public boat ramp. But sometimes we also help folks on private water bodies where those invasive infestations may move to other water bodies. So I'll start with aquatic plant identification. This is really key. This is where it all begins. Without knowing the identification of invasive aquatic plants, you really can't move forward with management or preservation in the case of some natives. So I just have a couple of plants that I highlight here: northern water milfoil, common bladderwort, and water clover, just as examples of pictures that would be helpful for identification. So one way that I can help with this is for folks to email me pictures. I can take a look at those and help identify. So 3 things that I request that folks send if you're going to send pictures would be ideally a picture of a whole plant, pictures of leaves and leaf attachment, as well as reproductive structures if those are available. And in terms of a whole plant, many folks will want to send just a picture from standing on their boat or their dock. But the plants won't hurt you. You can reach in there and grab them or use a rake to pull those up and bring them up on your boat or dock and get a good picture of that whole plant. That's really helpful. So ways that I might follow up would be a site visit, actually coming out to your lake and taking a look at the plants there. I might consult with another expert. There are a number of other aquatic plant experts in the state, so I might consult with them. And kind of as a final resort, we might do genetic testing. This is particularly helpful with water milfoil species. So this is a native one here, northern water milfoil, but they can be really difficult to tell apart from other water milfoil species. So we might have to send those in for genetic testing. So next, aquatic plant distribution. The program has been collecting aquatic plant data since 1994, so for almost 30 years now. The types of things that we monitor are for new populations of aquatic invasive plants. We monitor for changes in aquatic invasive plant populations. So how are those populations changing over time, as well as how those populations might be changing as a result of management or control efforts. So we look at grant-funded projects, as Lisbeth mentions. We'll go to those lakes that have been funded for aquatic plant control and see how those aquatic invasive plants are changing over time. And so what all this data has resulted in is a publicly accessible and available data set that anyone can look into. So this is what we call the Ecology Lakes Environmental Database. You can find this at that link there that I am posting. And on the slide, I'm not sure if these will be shared, but I can always drop this in the chat as well for folks. And as I mentioned, this covers all the data that we've collected over the past about 30 years through the program. And just to give you an example of how you can use this database, oops, make sure my slide's advancing there. There we go. So you can go ahead and like type in a lake name into the database, and it will bring up all the data that we've collected for that lake. So here's an example of American Lake in Pierce County. And as you can see, again, when you select this lake, you're going to get a list of all the plants that we've encountered, both native and invasive. And here you'll see that the invasive plants have a little alien icon to indicate that they are invasive. And you can actually click on the common names to get some more information about these plants. You also see when we found these plants, and sometimes in situations where we've successfully eradicated a certain species, that will be listed as well. So this is really a great place to start if you're interested about your lake, what native and invasive species might be found there. Let's say you found a species on your lake, you're not sure about what it might be. This is a good place to start. The other way that you can use this database is filtering by plant species. So this is a species that Lisbeth mentioned, parrot feather. And so you can actually filter all of our data for lakes and water bodies where we found parrot feather. So this is a really excellent tool, again, to see what invasives might be in your lake or near your lake. And as you can see here at the bottom, it'll actually give you a list of all those lakes. So you can go check those out individually, see what notes we've written there, see when we were last visited. So I really encourage folks to check this out. It's a great resource for everyone. So the last way that we provide technical assistance is about aquatic plant management. So we can provide information on different approaches and techniques, different herbicides, give information about contractors and the permitting process. I can also connect folks with their local weed board or other agencies that might have more knowledge on local issues or an issue specific to their situation or water body. And lastly, we conduct research through our program. So whether that's new management techniques to see how effective they might be or new herbicides, we can also look at ongoing management, as well as looking at the impacts of invasive species on natives. So looking at the ecology of these invasive species and how they affect the natives in the aquatic environment. So I'm going to give a little bit more detail about some different types of aquatic plant management. These really fall into three broad categories. Physical, meaning just as its name implies, so actual physical removal of aquatic plants from the environment, as demonstrated by this big piece of equipment up here in the picture. Chemical, which would be using herbicides. And lastly, biological. So this would be using organisms such as insects, which can actually eat the aquatic plants, such as this little insect here at the bottom. So for all these approaches, there's permits and licenses that are going to be required. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on these, but these are going to come from the Department of Ecology, Department of Agriculture, as well as the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So a little bit more detail on physical management approaches. Here's just a couple examples of these approaches with some pictures as well. I'm going to bring up my little laser pointer here. So, the most selective of these would be hand pulling. And so this is a convenient situation where the water's been drawn down and these gentlemen are plucking an invasive aquatic plant from the lake bed. But this can also be done by divers, scuba diving, other situations such as that. There's also suction harvesting or diver-assisted suction harvesting, where a diver will actually go down with essentially a hose and can suck up aquatic plants from the lake bottom. Benthic barriers, as shown here, where a tarp or mat is placed on the bottom of a lake bed to prevent aquatic plant growth. And then kind of less selective approaches might be raking, which can literally be done with a garden rake, or there's specialized rakes that are available. mechanical harvesting. So sometimes these big harvesters are used to actually mow the aquatic plants down. And then also tools such as drawdown, where there's a water control structure, you can actually draw down the water level. And I just wanted to mention that these kind of are on a spectrum from selective to less selective. Something like hand pulling could be best for a small infestation where you can actually go in, pull those plants by hand, on down to something like harvesting or drawdown, where you might have larger populations or the entire lake might be infested. So different tools to work best in different situations. And it also depends on the plants that you're encountering there as well. One thing that's important to note is that all of these are going to require some form of permit coverage. Even things such as hand pulling, which may seem small. Now, the good news is that a lot of these smaller efforts or smaller tools can be covered by just having what's called the Aquatic Plants and Fish pamphlet. This is provided by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. So folks who are interested in management, especially physical management, I encourage them to check out this permit. I have a link here as well, rather this pamphlet, and provide information about different approaches, when they might be best used, and also provide information on the approaches that are covered by just having the pamphlet in hand. So small hand pulling efforts are going to be covered by just having that pamphlet, but bigger projects are going to require a different kind of permit. So I won't go into detail on that, but it's called an HPA, or hydraulic permit approval. That's also going to come from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. So this pamphlet will explain that and tell you what situations work and which don't. So I encourage folks, if you're interested, to start there. And then I'm also happy to answer questions about this as well. All right, the next approach is going to be chemical. So I'm not going to go into detail on these chemicals here, but these are all been approved for aquatic use in Washington. These are all approved herbicides. What I want to mention here is that in order to apply these products, folks are going to need applicator license from the Washington Department of Agriculture. And typically what folks do, if they're interested in managing aquatic plants on their water body, they're going to get a contractor that already holds a license to apply that herbicide. Any herbicide that's applied is also going to have to fall under permit coverage from the Department of Ecology. Typically, folks are going to be using what's called the Aquatic Plant and Algae Management General Permit. For folks who are doing management on lakes of aquatic invasive plants, that's typically the permit that they're going to have to acquire. I want to mention here that this process does take some time. So unfortunately, it's not the case where you find an invasive on your lake and then the next day or week you can get out and manage that with herbicides. And that's not a bad thing, because typically we want to make sure that you're using the right products and using them in the right situation. And that's why that process can take some time. And there's also, folks need to be notified in the water body that these chemicals are going to be applied. So I do have a link again here on the bottom. This is to the Department of Ecology's webpage on permitting. So I encourage folks to check that out if that's a route that they're interested in. So some things to consider with chemical management. First and foremost, that some of these products can have impacts to fish and other aquatic organisms. And this really plays into the timing of treatment. So at those earlier life stages of amphibians and fish, they can be more impacted by some of the herbicides that are used. The WDFW, Department of Fish and Wildlife, has a great tool. You can actually go online. I don't have the link for this, but I can share that with folks if they're interested. But basically, it's a tool to check out whether your water body falls under any kind of use restrictions or timing restrictions. And this is really great. It has these color-coded water bodies here that tell you, lakes such as this one that's in green. I want to say this is Chambers Lake. I might be wrong. But that has, year-round use of herbicides, so there's not any restrictions. Whereas other lakes, such as these ones in yellow, are going to have a special timing window where you're not allowed to use herbicides at certain times of the year, on down to these that are in red, which it suggested that you avoid treatment. So these are also issues to work with WDFW on for your specific lake as well. Other things to consider would be water movement. So in flowing water systems, herbicides are going to be a lot less effective. There's also things such as product specificity. So certain products are going to work better in certain species or certain situations. Other products are going to be more broad scale, and they're going to work on a suite of species. And lastly, there's going to be use restrictions on a lot of these products. So restrictions on how soon after applying them can you swim or drink the water or use for irrigation. So all things to consider if you're considering chemical management of aquatic plants. So moving on to the next part of my talk here, I'm going to be talking about 5 different invasive aquatic plants to look out for in the state, some of which you might be familiar with and other ones might be new to you. So those are Eurasian water milfoil, variable leaf water milfoil, flowering rush, and Brazilian waterweed and yellow floating heart. So I wanted to start off with one that folks are probably going to be familiar with. That's Eurasian water milfoil, or Myriophyllum spicatum as the scientific name. This is native to Europe, Asia, and Africa. It's been in the US since before 1900 and Washington since about the 1960s. So it's been around for a long time. It's currently listed as a Class B noxious weed. So as Anne mentioned, this is one that is designated for control in areas where it's not already widespread. This species also poses some challenges because it can hybridize with a native species. It's called northern water milfoil, or Myriophyllum severicum. In terms of ID, again, I know most folks are going to be familiar with this plant, but it's going to have a column-like shape in the water column. And let's see here. There we go. So you can see these kind of columns of plants, and then they're going to spread out on the water surface as they grow later into the season. It has finely dissected leaves that are going to be in whorls of 4. So at each point where a leaf attaches to the stem, there's actually going to be 4 leaves that are attached. In terms of the flowering stalks, these aren't always going to be present, but when they are, you're going to see a stalk with very tiny flowers and no apparent leaves. It's just going to be this kind of naked stem here with the flowers. And that's going to differentiate it from another species that I'm going to mention next. So here's just some photos of Eurasian water milfoil infestations. Again, as Elizabeth mentioned, this can impact property values, and you can see why. It can form these dense mats on the water surface. You certainly probably wouldn't want to swim through that. It's also difficult to navigate your boat, canoe, kayak through that as well. This is a picture actually of Eurasian water milfoil that is hybridized with the northern water milfoil, which is native. And these hybrids actually are quite invasive themselves. So again, you can see this very dense surface mat, which would be very difficult to navigate to. In terms of its distribution, Eurasian water milfoil is well distributed throughout the United States, as you can see in this map, as well as in the state of Washington. A couple things I want to note, though, is that it's not everywhere. So there certainly are areas where it has not infested, and that makes spread prevention even that much more important. So I also want to note that even areas where it has gotten into, when we've caught it early, we've been able to eradicate this plant. So just because you may find a strand of milfoil on your lake, it's not a death sentence. It doesn't mean that your lake is toast. It's certainly something that can be dealt with. So the next plant I'm going to talk about is variable leaf water milfoil. So a cousin to Eurasian water milfoil. The scientific name is Myriophyllum heterophyllum. And this one is unique in that it's actually native to the Southeastern United States. It's popular in the aquarium trade, which has let it spread, folks dumping aquariums. And because of this, it's actually become invasive in the Northeast US, as well as Washington and Europe. So it was first found relatively recently, 2006 in Washington. Up until 2021, only a handful of water bodies were known to be infested. Unfortunately, we found quite a few more just in the last year in Clark County, but we're working on getting those under control. This species also hybridizes with one of our native water milfoils, which again can make ID quite difficult. But I'm going to give you a couple clues that can lead you on the right track here. Before that, I'll also mention this is a Class A noxious weed, so different than Eurasian water milfoil. This one's slated for eradication wherever it is found, and that is because its distribution is so small. So in overall appearance, it can be similar to Eurasian water milfoil. It's got this columnar shape. It can spread out on the surface of the water. But one thing that's going to distinguish it is that its flower stalks actually have these leaves, these oval or linear shaped leaves on the flowering stalks, which is going to be quite different than Eurasian water milfoil. It also is going to have a bushier appearance in the water column. I have a couple pictures that are going to demonstrate that really nicely. And there's also going to be a smaller space in between these whorls of leaves. So as the stem indicates, it's going to be much bushier and less stringy as Eurasian water milfoil can appear. These are some pictures actually from Europe, from France and Germany, showing how dense these infestations can get. If you look really closely, there's actually a bird walking on top of the mat of plants here. So these can fill the water column, spread out, really impede navigation. Here's some photos from Washington. You can see here that really bushy appearance of the plants. And then here's where some plants have actually been stranded after a drawdown in a reservoir, and they're actually thriving in this muddy environment. So really dense, really bushy, really problematic plant. Here is its native and non-native range in the United States. You can see this native range is indicated by orange and non-native by this reddish brown. You can see here in Washington as well. And its distribution in Washington is relatively limited. As I said, it's just limited to the western side of Washington. And I indicated these new populations here in Clark County as well. So being a Class A noxious weed, the hope is that these populations can be eradicated. And we've really made some great progress in trying to eradicate some of those populations. So next, this one has received a lot of attention lately, flowering rush, Butomus umbellatus. The species native to Europe and Asia, first introduced in North America just before 1900 in the St. Lawrence River. Some notable Western North America introductions include 1949 in Southeast Idaho and 1964 in Flathead Lake, Montana. And from that Flathead Lake population, that's likely where some of the plants have spread into Idaho and subsequently Washington as well. We've known it's been in Washington since the 1990s, very well could have been there sooner. And this is also a Class A noxious weed, so designated for eradication everywhere in the state where it's found. So you'll see this as a quite unique look to it, and this next slide is going to highlight some of the identification features of this plant. So one thing that is very clear is that it's going to have this distinct flower. The problem is it doesn't always flower. So oftentimes you'll just see the plants looking like this above the water or like this below the water. So flowering rush is unique in that it can have this emergent growth form that grows above the water or actually in muddy substrate, or fully aquatic, and it can have these long stems that are just fully under the water. The stems are going to be triangular, but they also flatten and twist as they get towards the top. So this could look like similar species such as cattails or burrweed, but the twisting stems, the triangular stems are going to be things that distinguish it if you don't have flowers. Again, if you do have flowers, there's nothing else that's going to look like this plant. So it's going to have these six petals, pink flower that's going to be very distinct. It also has these rhizomes from which it spreads, so it creeps along the lake bottom with these rhizomes. These can also break off and form new plants. Here's just some pictures. I really want to highlight that this plant is very tolerant of many environmental conditions. It can grow in up to 20 feet of water, as demonstrated by this picture here. It can grow emergent up out of the water column in muddy substrate. Here's a good demonstration of these kind of twisty leaves that it produces. Dry ground, this rocky substrate, and then in just a full kind of wetland environment. So very tolerant of different environmental conditions, which has really led to its invasiveness and its ability to spread well beyond where it's been introduced. So I want folks to really keep that in mind. In terms of its distribution in Washington state, I want to pre-apologize for the red and green coloration. I didn't choose that, but here we have where it occurs in red dots and where it has been surveyed for but has not been found in these green dots. This isn't the most up-to-date map. We're working on updating this map, but this is just to give you an idea of where this plant occurs. This here would be the Pend Oreille River. You have also tributaries of the Columbia River here and the Spokane River, and then the main stem of the Columbia River as well, where it has been found. The Yakima River as well. Outside of these river systems, there's been isolated populations in Whatcom County, as well as Joint Base Lewis-McChord. So again, we found it in a lot of areas, but we want to continue to monitor this species, make sure it doesn't spread, and try our best to eradicate it from the areas where it's currently located. All right, the next plant is Brazilian waterweed, or Agarria densa. This one is native to South America, as its name implies. It's really popular in the aquarium trade and for biology education. Many folks will put it in aquariums and then unfortunately dump those aquariums, which has led to its spread. It's been in Washington since at least the 1970s, and it's currently listed as a Class B noxious weed, again, designated for control in areas where it's not widespread. In terms of ID, it's going to have these simple leaves that are going to be in whorls of 4. So you can see along the stem, we have these whorls of leaves, and they're always going to be grouped in 4. It also occasionally is going to produce flowers that are going to have these 3 white petals. Here's what it looks like in an infestation. As you can see, similar to the milfoil species we've looked at, it's going to fill this water column. This can also have detrimental effects on the water chemistry and aquatic organisms that are living in the water bodies. So really a problematic species. In regards to its distribution, again, in many areas across the US, but in Washington is limited to the west side of the state. So this, again, you think back to that Class B designation, we want to prevent it from spreading to new areas, especially the eastern part of the state. All right, lastly, I'm going to talk about a species called yellow floating heart, or Nymphoides pautata. The species is also native to Eurasia. It's an ornamental species, so it's been intentionally planted in many locations. First introduced to the US in the 1800s, so been around for a long time. And particularly, it's been in Washington for a long time, at least since the 1930s, in Long Lake in the Turnbull National Wildlife Refuge in Spokane County. So it actually has some quite large infestations there in Spokane County, which is why it's listed as a Class B noxious weed. So there's many areas of the state that it is not invaded, and we want to try to prevent it from getting into those new areas. In terms of ID, this plant is pretty distinct. The first thing you'll notice is that it looks similar to whitewater lily, which is also invasive, as well as our native pond lilies. But some things that are going to distinguish it from these species are it's going to have these wavy leaf margins. Also, these leaves are not going to get very big, so only up to about 6 inches. So our native and the other invasive plants are not going to share those characteristics. The other thing is that it's going to have this characteristic 5-petaled yellow flower. Very distinct. No other plants are going to have this combination of features. So just a picture of its infestation. This is in, I believe this is from Lake Spokane. Very dense infestation. This is not yet flowering, but when it does flower, this is what it looks like. So as one of the folks mentioned earlier, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So this could look really nice to some folks, but unfortunately, this means that there's probably not any other native plants that are living among these plants. So quite problematic. Here's its distribution in the US and Washington State. So quite patchy distribution. We want to keep it that way. This is that Long Lake, the National Wildlife Refuge, and as I mentioned, other areas along Spokane River. So this is a plant that we can really keep contained. All right, time for the poll question. I'm not sure, I think Maria will jump in and maybe put this in the chat or put it somewhere, but
Yeah.
I'll go, oh, all right, it's already up there. So I'll just read it out for folks. What feature makes flowering rush so invasive? First option is its seeds are wind distributed. Second option is that it is a free-floating aquatic plant. Third option is it is tolerant of a range of environmental conditions. Or the fourth option is it has pink flowers. So I'll give folks a moment to answer that question.
All right, yeah, 53. Oh, okay, we're still going up. 57%.
All right.
We want to see at least 2/3.
Okay. Hopefully this is easy for folks, but
Okay. Got 20 out of 26. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
So I'm going to end the poll and Wes can discuss the right answer.
Great. Okay. So the right answer is C. All right. People did really great. Yeah, so it's tolerant of a range of environmental conditions. So because of that, it can live in places other plants cannot. It can spread to areas that never had plants in it before, which makes it really problematic. So that's a good takeaway. I'm glad folks got that. I feel like I gave a couple winks and nods at that point. So great, everyone was paying attention. So with that said, I'm going to end just by echoing Elizabeth's points about preventing the spread of aquatic invasive plants. It's really easy. You know, most folks talk about these 3 steps: cleaning, draining, and drying. Once you pull your boat or your gear or you step out of a water body, just do a quick check. It's really easy. Most of the times you'll see very obvious plants hanging on your prop, on your trailer, sometimes in your boots. Pluck those off, drain all the water from your boat. That helps with aquatic plants, but it's also really helpful for getting rid of things that you might be carrying in the water, such as zebra or quagga mussel veligers, and even pathogens for fish and amphibians and other aquatic organisms. And lastly, if you can, leave your boat and gear out of the lake for a couple of days. And you know, if you can't do that, and in addition to doing that, you can wipe down all your gear as best you can to dry it off before heading to another water body. I know I'm at my time here, so I just want to say thank you to everyone again for having me here to talk. And for listening. Folks, feel free to email me at this email address or give me a call. Again, for plant ID questions, any of the things I discussed, it's my job to provide that technical assistance. So I'm really happy to help out. So thank you so much.
All right. Thanks so much, Wes. All right. Now we have Lauren Keene from the Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council, and she's going to talk about the Early Detection and Rapid Response Program.
All right, I'm just going to move my there. Okay. Oh, and one more thing. I did not get my didn't get my room set up, apparently, not the correct direction. So you can hear me okay, Maria?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let's hopefully the screen sharing works out fine. Okay, and then this is always fun, changing to the slideshow. And my video was freaking out earlier, but it seems to be okay now, but I will keep it on. And if it does freak out, then I will, you know, I'll just turn off my video, but keep the audio on. Okay, so you should be seeing the PowerPoint in presentation view.
Yes.
Okay, great. Excellent. All right, so thank you for inviting me to be part of this. My name is Lauren Keene, and I'm an environmental scientist. I did a lot of many years of research at the University of Washington as part of the Freshwater Ecology and Conservation Lab. And then a few years ago, I guess, I switched and now do independent consulting, but still with an emphasis on freshwater ecosystems and with an emphasis on invasive ecology, both the ecological impacts of invasive plants and also animals, and then also distribution of invasive species, and then as particularly with respect to plants, the management and prevention. So doing work that looks at management and prevention of their spread and distribution. And today, the focus of this talk is on the, sorry, let me move. Okay. The focus of this talk is on the program for early detection and rapid response that is put on by the Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council, which I'll talk about. And Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council has a coordinated program to train citizen scientists to detect and report invasive species early. But overall, this talk should also be about emphasizing the concept and the critical importance of early detection and rapid response for invasive plants and also animals too. So the Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council has works with many, many other programs and supporters and coordinates efforts with these other groups. And if you can imagine, you know, we have a huge Pacific Northwest region for the Invasive Plant Council is Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. It's a huge geographic area. There's no way that, you know, one organization can, you know, coordinate sort of boots on the ground and keeping an eye on these. However, there are many different organizations that have differing interests well, all of them have the same interest in reducing spread and preventing spread of invasive species. And so Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council works with organizations that are listed here closely to coordinate efforts across these different agencies and groups. What is the Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council? It's one of 6 regional councils that also together work together at the national level to help prioritize and bring focus and awareness to prevention and management of invasive plants. And the mission is very straightforward: to work to protect Pacific Northwest landscapes from invasive non-Indigenous plants. Now, it makes sense that councils would be regional because we have different species that are likely to be present here. We have different native communities that are likely to be impacted differently potentially than other places. And we may even have different vectors, dominant vectors where invasive plants would be coming in. So that's why each of the invasive plant councils has a regional focus that then they coordinate across nationally as well. And you can see here the other regional invasive plant councils. So the focus, a huge emphasis of this talk is on what's called early detection and rapid response. And the Invasive Plant Council has a website, which is shown here. I can also drop the, I'll drop a link in the chat later on to specific events and trainings that are upcoming. But all of the information about everything that they do is found on their website, and especially, you know, about early detection and rapid response. Some of the main programs is the Citizen Science Invasive Plant Program, where we're training citizens to identify and report invasive species. And this, it reduces the ecological impacts, it reduces potential economic impacts, it controls secondary spread. And then it also, there's costs associated with managing invasive plants. And so the larger the infestation gets, the more water bodies that it spreads to, the greater those ecological and economic costs become. So a few of the ways that they do this is we have workshops and trainings. We participate in trainings like this. Also in-person trainings, both, there's actually one coming up this weekend, and then there's more coming up throughout the spring and the summer, which I'll talk about later. There's a listserv, and then obviously the website. And the listserv, once folks are on the listserv, they get ping, you know, about new and current events, new and current species of concern. The Citizen Science Program is in collaboration, I mentioned, with many of those agencies that I showed. One of the, and also it's in collaboration across the nation, right, is that each of the regional councils is promoting and using the same mapping program that I'll talk about, which is EdMaps West. Sorry, EdMaps, is it supposed to be West? Sorry, it's EdMaps. I thought I had updated all of these. Anyway, it is a web-based portal for reporting and aggregating data at the national level. And then what that does is that it allows Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council to work as a liaison between the person that is doing the reporting of the plant and the landowner or land manager. And that way, the person, the entity, it's usually a landowner of some kind, is thereby notified that they have an invasive plant on their land, and also Pacific Northwest IPC can help them coordinate how to, you know, best practices in terms of managing that. Okay, so talking a little bit about early detection and rapid response, I think Lisbeth and Wes have both touched on this for sure, but this is really, I mean, I just can't even emphasize how important that early recognition is. And of course, the challenge is that when something is uncommon and rare, it is more difficult to detect. And this is where the power and the potential of citizen science comes in, is that not only do citizen scientists make it possible to keep an eye on more places, but there's actually an enormous, and I'll talk about some case studies later, there's a huge amount of value in just noticing that something is different. And so many of the people that have successfully reported early infestations of plants or early invasions of wildlife have done so because they simply noticed that something didn't look right in their place. And so it is not possible for agencies to train everyone, and have enough boots on the ground to do both of those things, to both cover enough places and also be, very carefully aware of their own places. Whereas someone that has a garden there, or someone that walks a lake every day, or someone that walks a trail commonly, they really are often in a really good position to just notice that something is different. So we have these phases of invasive species invasion and control. We have this introduction or this first occurrence, and of course, abundance at that. This is the challenge. Abundance at that first occurrence is very unusual. And then we start to have growth over time. This period can take a long time. It can be very rapid. It depends on the species. And then we have this another period of time that can vary in its lag time, where the presence and the abundance of the species is growing. And this is somewhere where public awareness typically begins. All of a sudden, someone's lake has been overtaken or multiple lakes have been overtaken, or they don't want to swim there anymore, right? These impacts start to be felt, or the native plants are getting outcompeted. So some sort of impact is being seen or felt. And this is where public awareness begins. Oops, my mouse. There we go. This is where public awareness starts to begin. However, at that point, we have already passed a point where it is easy or relatively easy to control. So control and management are obviously much easier when the plant is at the plant or the animal is at a low level of infestation and abundance. And then we start to get into a high abundance, high prevalence situation where it's often about managing spread of the species at that point. And here, down at this end, we have increasing costs of the economy, increasing challenges to the ecosystems, and then also increasing control costs. Oh, it looks like my video has decided to stop. Oh, now I'm back. Okay, we'll try it, let it keep going. Okay. And then this is, of course, where the potential and the positive, really positive benefits of early detection and rapid response come in, is that if we can detect this at a low level of abundance, it becomes possible not only to control the species, but also to prevent what's called secondary spread. So Wes and Lisbeth have both talked about this. I have just briefly sort of summarized it. The costs of invasive species can be ecological, economic, and then the two of those can be merged, of course, as that increases detriment to ecosystems, especially potentially agricultural ecosystems or recreational ecosystems have economic costs. So the estimates are more than $137 billion a year nationally. They can have huge impacts on threatened or endangered species. So threatened or endangered species are often under threat from different types of impacts. And so invasive species become one more pressure on those species. They can have big threats to industry. Fishing, farming, timber, and hydropower. So are all both threatened by and have to devote a lot of control and management costs to preventing and controlling invasive species. There can be impacts like increases in wildfires and livestock poisonings. Also, Lisbeth mentioned reduction of property values. So for example, if a lake water body is taken over by an invasive plant and it becomes less attractive for recreation, the property values for those lake owners have been demonstrated to decrease or can decrease. And then of course, we can often see anybody that has tried to forage through a field of blackberries to get to their favorite river fishing place knows that invasive species impede recreation, boating, swimming, gardening, hiking, swimming, sorry, I already said swimming, I think, fishing and hunting. And then there can actually be some invasive plants and animals that can threaten human health and safety. Again, these can result in economic costs. So Wes and Lisbeth have both talked about this. I'm just going to really briefly go over this cycle, because I think sometimes it's very easy to think, oh, it's just one plant. How does how can it have such a huge impact? And so often these are kind of a cycle, and I'll show this in the next slide, is that aquatic plants, so if you can think of lakes especially, don't have a lot of structure, and plants are providing that structure. They provide things like food for insects and invertebrates. They provide shelter for small fish. They're providing food, nesting materials. They're also holding, kind of much the way that trees hold sediment on the land, plants hold sediment in lakes, so they prevent erosion. And then they're cycling, they're producing oxygen, also transpiring at night. And so they're impacting things like oxygen and creating oxygen, higher oxygen conditions. And then acidity as well is impacted. So nutrients and oxygen and nutrient dynamics are impacted. So what happens, this is not an uncommon scenario for an invasive plant in a water body, is that we end up with things that are called trophic cascades. And so often invasive plants are very dominant. And so they'll just fill up the entire water column of the surface or the surface of the lake or the stream, as it were. This often has the result of outcompeting our native plants. This can reduce fish habitat. So fish like kind of a medium amount of plants. They don't like too much plants. They don't like too little plants, but they also don't like too much plants. The density of that impedes their growth, their movement, and kind of tends to favor certain types of fish species, often invasive species. We end up with biomass changes in the dissolved oxygen dynamics. Also, the lake can't mix, and so the oxygen that would normally mix from the air to the water can't actually get there. And then we have these shifts in availability and cycling of nutrients. And this can actually, in some of the research that I've documented, it can facilitate, then it creates an ecosystem that is more conducive to often other invasive species, such as sunfish, suntarchids, or even things like bullfrogs. So we end up with almost these entirely new ecosystems that are called novel ecosystems. And this can happen just from the introduction of one plant species that can take over or dominate in a water body. So the Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council uses a particular mapping app and trains citizen scientists in how to use this mapping app, which is then consolidated, not only reported locally, and the information is reported to the landowner themselves, but then that information is also aggregated at a national level and is publicly available for research. So I'll talk, the next 3 slides are about the EDSMAPS app. And this is a web-based mapping system. You download it on an app on your phone. It was launched in 2005. So, wow, okay, it's 18 years old now. It's been, refined over a long period of time and is well established. It includes all of the United States and Canada. And it does aggregate data from a couple different databases that I'll talk about. However, it is better to use the actual EDMAPS app itself, and I'll talk about why that is. But there's a couple of different features. There's a dashboard, there's web reporting, there's data downloads available for researchers, kind of a little bit in the way that Wes talked about the lakes database being useful for, finding out what is in your area or in your water body. The EDMAPS app you can go online and look at what other people have reported, look at what is present in your area already, and also available for research as well. So there are different kinds of apps for species ID and reporting. Some of you may, use some of these, may have seen. There's Seek by iNaturalist, which is more of an identifier, but it can also be used to report species. It's not specific for invasive species, however. There's King County has a web mapping app, and then also the Washington Invasive Plant Council. There's also PlantNet. These are all popular and widely used apps. A couple of these do report to EDMAPS. However, the Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council does not get, so it will go and get consolidated nationally at the national and state level, but the Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council won't get the report and therefore can't liaison with the landowner. And so using the EDMAPS app is actually the more direct way to report invasive plants and animals as well. And then this is, if you were to go to the EDMAPS features, and these are some of the features that are available, is that also the data that is submitted is vetted and verified by an expert. It's reviewed. So that's another important feature to it. And then we can map occurrence at different scales. We can even aggregate by source and then, tracking trends and these kind of things over time. So it is a very powerful tool that has been around for a long time, and reporting and using EdMaps is a huge help both locally and nationally. Okay, so a couple more slides, and I think that's all that I have. Prevention is obviously the best solution. We always want to prevent. So things like cleaning, draining, drying your boat, paying attention to things that are on waders or boots, just kind of trying to raise awareness. One time I, found a neighbor posting that they were about to let their fish go on my Facebook page. And I, gently kind of reminded them, like, this isn't a good idea, right? So even being proactive and being an advocate about the prevention of introducing invasive species, whether they're in water bodies or vectors of terrestrial spread as well, are both really, really important. Becoming an advocate, being willing to inform yourself and become an advocate for reducing spread is really important. Prevention is key. However, next to prevention, this early detection, rapid response is really critical to reducing not only the likelihood of that plant establishing permanently, but reducing the economic and ecological impacts. If it's possible to contain a plant to one water body, that is an enormous benefit as opposed to having it spread to 50 water bodies. Just a couple of, I kind of mentioned this earlier, is that these are a few kind of little, I don't want to call them case studies, that's not the right, but these are, it is not uncommon for citizen scientists to report these, invasive species. These are just a couple of examples, local examples here in Washington State, recent. And again, the basis of these is that there's usually, for all of these, there was some intersection of people who live in an area or use an area recreationally or are willing to patrol an area so they had some training, or they gained or obtained some training. And then they also were in a place that they frequent quite often. One person was in their rose garden and they saw a report about Japanese beetles. And so they, knew to turn it in. Another person is friends of Green Lake and they are familiar with the lake, so they reported something new. So this intersection of knowing a place or visiting a place often and gaining some information to inform yourself of that can be a very, very powerful combination for combating spread of invasive species. And on that note, if you want to come even this weekend in Skagit County, there's an in-person training. We will have a presentation where we'll cover some of this information and then more information about specific species. And then there's a group survey of areas where we go out and actually look at and learn plants, and then working through the EdMaps app. And not only this, I'm going to drop a link in the chat, I think. Get back. Here we go. I'm going to drop a link in the chat for upcoming trainings. And if you go to that and sign up for the listserv as well, you can get notified about all of the trainings that are upcoming, or just check the website. There's multiple trainings that are upcoming, especially in the, as the weather warms. And I think that's all that I have. Hopefully I didn't forget anything.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. All right. Well, that concludes the speaker portion of the webinar, and the Q&A box is empty for now, but please think and drop some questions if you have any for the speakers. There is a question in the chat. Does the Invasive Plant Council notify local weed boards?
Oh, I'm still not muted. Okay.
Any speaker who knows that can just jump in.
The Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council notifies the landowner, coordinates with the landowner. I don't, Elizabeth, you might know if there's a specific emphasis on contacting the weed board. I don't know of that specific. I think often the weed board, depending on what the species is, the weed board might be consulted about what would be the most appropriate response depending on the species. But Elizabeth probably know for sure more.
Yeah, a lot of the folks on weed boards will sign up to be alerted when particular Class A or Class B weeds are found in their county and their locations, and they'll be alerted via the EdMaps app as to something, and then they can contact us. But usually the outreach coordinator will contact the land manager, which typically the past several years has been the U.S. Forest Service. It's where we've been getting our funding and where we kind of direct people to do their surveying.
Okay. Great, we have, let's see. Danica wants to know how she signs up to be alerted.
Oh, weed coordinator wanted to know that?
Yes, I believe she is.
Okay.
Yes, she is.
Sure, she can contact Chuck Bargeron at EdMaps, or she can go through myself through the Ecology email or UW email, and I can get her and she or him in contact with Chuck at EdMaps, and they can let them, help them through that process.
Thank you. Any other questions from the attendees?
I really enjoyed Lauren speaking about the importance of data and how that information can inform research and early detection, rapid response. Can we speak a little bit to that? I know that oftentimes we don't have good data for things that are widespread, and I think there's an argument to be made for the importance of all data.
I would love to reiterate that, and I notice this over and over again, that we don't bother to collect data until we recognize a problem, at which point we need the data, but it's too late to go back and collect it. And so we realize that we have a problem and we have so little information with which to address it. We're sort of scrounging for anecdotes at that point, or, who remembers? Does anybody remember when this thing first appeared? Or, I mean, it really is a problem that we don't start collecting data. So on that early detection rapid response curve that I showed you, it could even probably have not only does public awareness start at that increasing curve, but the research reaction doesn't start until then either. And so that's the point at which we start to recognize that we have a problem. Then it's like, oh, I guess we should start studying this species, or I guess we should start figuring out its distribution elsewhere, or I guess we should start. I don't want to imply that it's sort of laziness. That's not the case at all. It's just that it's very easy to, it tends to be a sort of reactive process without this kind of effort where there's a proactive, sustained, reporting over time. And then, like, I've used that lakes database so many times, and I know Department DOE has been churning away on that lakes database for 30 years. And it's just now it's a 30-year data set that is highly unusual. At least in my world, it's highly unusual. And I think that the data collection part almost really is a huge component. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, that's kind of Jen Parsons' legacy, is that lakes database.
Yeah, I'll just chime in there. Yeah, totally agree with that. I can't really take credit for that, as I probably didn't mention. I'm new to this position, but Jennifer Parsons was in this position for 25 plus years before me, and really worked on collecting that data. And just to reiterate Lauren's point, and many times, even the researchers don't necessarily know about a certain species, or may not know how to ID a certain species. So, the more pictures people are taking and sharing them with other folks, whether that's through these apps or with me or anyone else here on this panel, we can at least direct you to the right person. So I want to reiterate that email channel is always open. If you don't want to have to bother with an app or something like that, email one of us or email me. But those things are quite easy. So whether it's the Seek or the actual apps for invasive species, they're usually pretty easy to use. So I encourage folks, take a lot of pictures and share what's out there.
Great, thank you.
I don't know if it was,
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't remember. This must have been in your talk, and maybe I missed it. But when I go out and do the early detection rapid response trainings, something to reiterate too is not only to take pictures of the species, but to take like detailed pictures too, because it, like you said, it can be very difficult to recognize something. And so just sort of taking up, especially like a single blurry distant shot of a, go ahead and, you know, spend some time, take a couple of good photos of the leaf structure, of the stem, you know, of the any flower, any fruiting body. All of those things are, yeah, so go ahead and nerd out a little bit and take 5 or 6 good pictures, and that, yeah, that will be a big help.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's, I almost put a picture in my talk of a picture not to take, which is like from your boat 10 feet away from the plants that are over there, which, you know, I wish I could be that good. I'm sure we all wish we could ID a, you know, milfoil plant from 20 feet away, but yeah, totally, you know, those plants aren't going to hurt you. You can pluck one out and, you know, bring it up on shore and take some good photos, and it's fun to do too. So yeah, totally agree.
There's a question that says, is there a bridge between the info/data points on ED maps and iNaturalist and WSDA maps and the Washington invasive apps? It seems like a missed opportunity if we are not able to easily share data across the platforms and with the county weed boards.
Elizabeth, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is that EdMaps is the bridge. Is that Washington Invasive Species Council, those reports should get to EdMaps. And I believe iNaturalist should get to EdMaps. As far as I know, King County's mapping does not, and PlantNet does not. So there's a couple that do, and there's a couple that don't. And then there's still, the part that is still missing there is that those other apps, although they get to the national EdMaps, they do not get routed through Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council. So even though there is some coordination, which I believe Chuck is, I mean, the desire is to do better coordination across those, but logistically it can be very difficult. And of course, low funding and, you know, right, it can be really challenging. So there is certainly the desire to make that happen. I think that it is happening in a very kind of limited way. My understanding is that EdMaps is intended to be the best, or it offers the best bridge.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound?
Yeah, that's what I understand. And I know Justin can address maybe how the WISC app works, but it's my understanding that EdMaps is now captures and bridges all of that data, but maybe some of the more local ones, like you were saying, that it does not. And yeah, it's been kind of a hard something that Chuck has been dealing with, Chuck Bergeron at EdMaps for many years, is trying to keep as much as possible, you know, the data in one location nationally. And it can be difficult because, you know, you have some folks that want to start their own data collection. So I don't know, Justin, if you wanted to say anything about the WISC app.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think one thing to note is that this has been a known issue for a long time. And in 2018, Western Governors Association actually came together to come up with data standards and data sharing agreements. So that basically gave all the major data aggregators guidance on what is the baseline level of information that each system should be collecting. And then also how should that be shared? And that work continues. You know, ultimately, there's never one database to rule them all because each organization that makes management decisions has their own needs. But if you share information regularly, then you're able to have one great picture. And so that included the major data aggregators, including the system called Bison, which is the National Park Services, I believe, in the Department of Interior, iNaturalist, IMAP Invasives, as well as EdMaps. And I think that has been a really big milestone in terms of data sharing. It's just then a question of how often do they all talk, and I'm sure that we wish they would do it more. The Invasive Species Council's application includes the majority of all noxious weeds and all the priority animals in the state, including insects. And it actually is connected to the early detection and distribution mapping system. So if you submit something, it goes immediately into that system, similar to the way the Invasive Plant Council's project works. I think the main point is if you see something, say something, tell anyone, and ultimately all these people talk and all these systems talk. So, just say something. Most importantly, never assume that someone knows about the occurrence, but maybe isn't responding.
Great. All right, well, if there are any more questions, feel free to still drop them in the Q&A. For those who are seeking pesticide recertification credits, let's see. Oops. All right, you can please put in the chat your first name, last name, license number, the state. We have Oregon and Washington pesticide credit, so I do need the state. And there is a code word, and the code word is aquatic. So in order to confirm that you stayed the whole webinar, please also put this code word here so that I know that you qualify for credit. So with these instructions, you're welcome to put them in the chat. There's a question, are credits applicable to Idaho? No, sorry, we only did Oregon and Washington. But thank you for coming from Idaho. That's really interesting. And for the future, if we get a lot of, if we get requests, we can certainly look into Idaho as well. Oh, Ryan, hand raised. So Ryan, if you have a question. Oh, okay, accident, okay. All right, well, if you have your license number in the chat, if you're seeking recertification credits and with no other questions, thank you so much for coming. And I wanted to especially thank the speakers for their time and sharing their programs and knowledge with us. So thank you all very much and happy Invasive Species Awareness Week.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.